Thanks for. Oh, people could watch and listen to this episode on. If you got Spotify, this is going to be a watch. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Tom Oakley.
Happy to be here.
And Sean Eiffe.
Hi.
And together, we're going to explore Key Stage 1 moderation. But first, Tom, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So this week I have come across a book that was published at the end of March. It's by Cambridge Mathematics. The lead author is Lucy Rycroft-Smith, and it's being created by the team who've put together the Cambridge Mathematics Espressos. So if you're familiar with the Espressos, they are short, condensed research guides that summarize the things that we need to know to help us develop our practice of teaching maths, and they're a great source for knowing what to read. The full title of the book is The Primary Teacher's Maths Journey Book, A Year of Professional Learning with Cambridge Mathematics. But, shorthand, the Maths Journey Book, I think it's going to be really useful for schools thinking about developing their practice, one area of maths at a time. So I've read the first section. It's broken into 4 sections: spring, summer, autumn, winter, almost like a development as you go through, and it guides you to think about how you respond to the research. So now you've read that, what do you think about ... So like I said, I'm only a quarter of the way into it. I think it looks really promising, and I can't wait to read the rest. Sean, what are you reading for?
At the moment, I am currently dipping in and out of Craig Barton's book, How I Wish I Taught Maths. I'm a new maths lead since September, so it's just a fantastic kind of it gives you great grounding really on just teaching and learning in general in maths. And I suppose it is it's a monster of a book, so like you really do have to take it in pieces and really kind of then come back to it and look at it again. We've been looking at in our school, but things like explicit instruction, and he obviously does quite a lot about that. And I found it very useful.
And so you're almost at the start of that journey, Sean, aren't you, this year? And you've been really engaging with as much as possible.
Yeah, very as much as I can, really. It's only when I took on this job I possibly realized how ill-equipped I was for it. And it's about really taken on as much information as possible, reading as many blogs as possible, and then that's kind of where I found out about that book in particular. Listen to podcasts like this, I suppose, and that's been really helpful just to give me a grounding, because I suppose it's coming at the position maths lead. It's one thing teaching your own class effectively and doing what I hope was a good job, but it's a whole other thing to disseminate that kind of good practice across the school. And also you might be disseminating something that works for you, but if it's not backed by the research, is it going to work for everyone else? So I think that's been helpful in that regard.
Nice. I think that connects up really well with your recommendation, Tom, because the espressos are great places to go for a lot of information in a really easily distilled and accessible sort of manner, I think. And like, for instance, whenever we were preparing for the number lines episode, one of the things I did was I went and looked at the sources and checked, well, which ones do I have? Have I read anything interesting in those? And I think, so for teachers who are just engaging with research, absolutely perfect. So I think, both your recommendations together are absolutely fantastic.
You can tackle them in little chunks. The espressos are published every other month. So there's not an expectation for you to read avidly loads of different things. It's time to take it on board, think about it, maybe apply it in your own practice before sharing it with others. And that's probably the way to tackle Craig's book as well, isn't it? You know, a little bit of a time, try and take it on board before moving on to the rest, because it's not a race, you know, it's not a race to get through all this stuff. And we can't ask everyone to improve everything at once. So it's picking the areas you want to choose. So yeah, they go together really well.
Kieran, what you reading for?
I think I mentioned last week that I was talking about manipulatives. Well, there's one paper that really, really interested me, and it gets quoted quite a lot. And it's called The Relative Effectiveness of a Symbolic and Concrete Model in Learning a Selected Mathematics Principle, which is a long way of saying they explored the efficacy of symbolic sort of representations in the instruction compared with the Cuisenaire rods. And I'm not going to spoil it. It's part of the talk. So anyone who's in their car right now, you know, this will be, it's the last thing I talk about, but probably the most important. And also, you know, so I recommend, even if you're not at the talk, it's by E.H. Fenema, and it's from 1972. But I think I'll link that under my thread about Saturday's talk when we get to that point. There you go. You guys have these nice practical suggestions, and I'm coming in with the 1972 title that doesn't make any sense.
Classic page turner that everyone should know about, but they don't. But now you've introduced them to it.
So this week we are going to focus on Key Stage 1 moderation. And essentially, when I thought about this episode, I thought about a survival guide, you know, a way to get through this year, because it's the first time we've had moderation, I think, for 2 academic years, but also in terms of preparation for next year as well, because we've had 1 year with less disruption, you know, still some disruption, but we've had no partial school closures. And so thinking about, well, okay, where are we going to be this time next year? What do we want to do? I think, Tom, my first question would be for you. And could you describe the moderation process for me?
Yeah, so just to clarify, do you want me to describe it from the point of view as the teacher who's going through moderation, the moderator who's preparing to moderate, or do you want me to try and cover all bases?
I think all bases would be great.
Yeah, sure. All right. So if we're thinking about from the very start of the school year, the year 2 teacher wants to be thinking about curriculum coverage and where the teacher assessment framework statements are coming up. So just to rewind a bit, we need to know that year 2 moderation is statutory. So that means there's lots of guidance that we need to follow. So everyone involved, head teachers, senior leaders, assessment leads, and particularly the year 2 teachers, need to know what that guidance is. And that guidance is gradually released throughout the year, apart from the teacher assessment framework, which has been out since 2018-19. That basically says that in reading, writing, maths and science, these are the criteria that children must reach to get the expected standard or working towards or what have you. In terms of statutory moderation, teachers have to present evidence for each of those statutory teacher assessment framework statements for reading, writing and maths. They don't have to do it for science. They don't have to do it for children who aren't yet working at subject-specific learning that might be assessed this year on something called the engagement model. Those of you who've been in Key Stage 1 for a long time will know of the P scales that used to exist for those children working pre-Key Stage, not yet learning anything subject-specific. Well, the engagement models replaced that. Those children, their work, their standards isn't going to be assessed. But for everyone else, we need to be thinking about where we're going to cover these statements for reading, writing and maths throughout the year. And hopefully the teacher, the assessment lead, the year group lead might be penciling those things into their yearly overviews. You know, oh, we've got time coming up here, great, that's where we'll get our evidence for that. So from the start of the year, we need to be thinking about that as a teacher, as a school leader. As a moderator, towards the start of the year, you're booking yourself into the moderation training. Because if you want to be a moderator, you have to go through like an accreditation process. You have to make sure you've been through a certain standard and you get the kind of approval to moderate by attending the training. This year it was all online, so it was self-guided study. And then you have to take part in a standardization exercise. And the standardization exercise is always for writing. You look at a collection of writing and you judge whether it's working towards expected standard or greater depth. And you do that for 3 students. And if all your judgments for those 3 students are right, then you can get the approval to moderate. So if, like me, you work for a local authority, you can be a lead moderator. If you work in a school, you can go through that same process as well. You can go through the training and all those kind of things. And if you have the availability, you can be a pool moderator. And a pool moderator means that you're going to join a lead moderator and you're going to go into other people's schools and support that out. So we're going around to spring. You've got your approval to moderate. Heading into summer, the moderators will have their last minute training, the things they need to know, kind of troubleshooting, what if this comes up, etc. Whereas in schools, teachers and senior leaders need to be making sure they have a clear idea of the types of evidence they're going to use. Now, for reading and for maths, you have to use the statutory tests. They have to form part of your judgment. So for those of you who've been reading Data Proof Your School and you've gone to the section about teacher assessment, you'll be reassured that it's not all on you, all on your judgment. You have to use those standardized tests, those statutory tests to inform your judgments. So hopefully that cancels out any bias that might have crept in. One of the main pieces of guidance that schools need to be aware of, particularly head teachers, is the assessment and reporting arrangements. It's got a section in it, section 4, called responsibilities. And the head teacher's list of responsibilities is absolutely eye-watering. There's a whole section for teacher assessment about making sure that teachers' judgments are accurate. Teachers have time to go on the training to know how they're meant to judge the children's work, all that kind of stuff. And schools have to carry out internal moderation. And the reason why schools have to carry out internal moderation is only 1 in 4 schools get chosen for statutory moderation every year. And no school can go more than 4 years without having statutory moderation. Now, of course, the last 2 years have been totally disrupted. So if you were due in 2020 or 2021, you're likely to be moderated this year or next. Yeah. But there can be other criteria for schools being bumped up or added to that list, because it's a minimum of 25% of schools. So if you have new school leadership, if you have early career teachers in year 2 or teachers new to year 2, that might bump you up the criteria to be moderated as well. So start of summer term, schools are getting their data together, their assessment together, they're doing their internal moderation. And this year, on Friday the 13th of all dates, Friday the 13th of May, schools will get that letter, email, or phone call from their local authority to say, you've been chosen to be moderated. And your moderator will be in touch to tell you which date. And the moderation window happens in June. And then we get to kind of the nub of it, the moderation day itself, where in a quarter of schools, a lead moderator or a pool moderator come in and they go through and have a professional discussion with you about how you've reached your judgments and try and reach the conclusion. Not only are your judgments for these children in the sample, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, how are these judgments accurate, but how are these judgments reflective of the whole class? So the moderation process isn't just a day. You kind of have to think about it as the whole year, the collection of the evidence, the preparing your judgments, your internal moderation, the statutory moderation, and then anything that happens in that moderation might then influence your judgments, for the rest of the class. And then by the end of June, you have to send off your final statutory assessment judgments to your local authority. I think this year it's the 28th of June, though I better check the ARA just to make sure I've got that date dead on. So I've whizzed through loads of that and I've waffled quite a bit. So which bits do you want me to clarify or expand on?
What's coming to mind, there are 2 things for me. The first one is when we talk about collecting evidence, we're not talking about generated evidence for evidence's sake. We're saying that the evidence that's available will be a byproduct of a really, for instance, rich mathematical experience in Key Stage 1.
In a normal school year, where schools might not have moved around their curriculum topics because of COVID and everything, I'd probably say, yeah, you'd have got through all your topics, you'll have covered all the things in the teacher assessment framework statements. But the teacher assessment framework statements, if we talk about maths for a second, they're not a best fit model at all. None of them are for reading, writing, or maths. You have to have evidence for every statement within a standard to say a child's working at that standard. So if there are 9 statements, something like that, for expected standard for maths, you need to be able to demonstrate that a child's met all 9 to be expected standard. If they've met 8 and missed out on 1, then they're the top end of working towards. And that feels harsh. But you as a school need to have given every child the opportunity to have met all 9. So that includes statements about fractions and time and measurement and geometry. So although with the best will in the world, we might think actually our children need a big, heavy year on number and we want to push those things to later, unfortunately, the statutory guidelines say you have to have covered all of those things to reach a judgment about your children's standard of work. So all the children need to have had a chance. So if teachers have moved their topics around or done things to a lesser degree than they might have done previously, then yeah, they might be in a slightly tighter spot to put their finger on that evidence. But yeah, if you've got a broad, balanced, well-structured curriculum, you can probably be quite confident you've done all your number, addition, subtraction, fractions, etc. Reading and writing, it's less of an issue because it judges the children's ability to read, to write, and it doesn't necessarily matter so much which topics you've done in which order. But math specifically this year, schools are going to have to give quite a bit of thought about the order in which they do things so that the children aren't disadvantaged by the length of time we spend on topics, or we can't leave anything post June and say, oh, we'll come on to time in July, because that would be a case for maladministration. We've submitted a judgment, the children are this, but they've not actually learned that yet, and we don't want anyone to be in that situation.
I mean, we all know my thoughts on when we should teach time, and that doesn't feature in my national curriculum. What are your thoughts on a task that shows multiple sort of the points being met, so to speak? So for instance, if you're reading time in quarters and you solve some sort of problem that involves using that, I'm not attaching numeric values to those quarters per se, but could you hypothetically say, okay, this child understands both fractions and time to the nearest quarter hour? Am I stretching?
I think you've stretched those statements. I think you might really struggle with those, but the teacher assessment framework and the teacher assessment guidance both say that one piece of work can be used for several statements. So the best example of that is the test paper, isn't it? You have to include that as a piece of evidence, and it's going to help you with several of the statements anyway. Great. But my best example that I try and give to schools is reading scales of measurement. So if the children read scales of measurement, great. But what do they do with that information? Do they then add those numbers together? Do they then calculate with it in some way? Do they find fractions of amounts with it? If they do, then great. We're really looking at several pieces of information right there. Because there are statements on there about partitioning, adding and subtracting, all these kind of things. Well, what are you partitioning? Where are you getting those values from? So if they're in context, like reading scales of measurement or quantities of money or that kind of thing, then yeah, absolutely. But again, that goes back to our point about a really rich and worthwhile curriculum. We want children to have purposeful reasons to add and subtract, to multiply and divide, to find fractions of amounts. And statistics and measurement are great for that. So yeah, those statistics objectives often provide us the opportunity to meet some of our place value ones as well, that we might have taught in September, October, and the children weren't particularly proficient at them then, but after a year of practice, they're now really good at it. If I was relying on their evidence from October for how good this child's place value is, I might be doing myself a disservice. But have they proven themselves at place value in their statistics work and measurement work? Yeah, they absolutely have. They've got better over time. So those carefully chosen pieces of work will show several pieces of evidence. And ultimately, whether it's an internal moderation, and I want to really stress that the vast majority of schools and every single teacher will go through internal moderation, and only a small number of schools comparatively will go through statutory moderation. They have to be able to talk the talk and go, right, here's how I've made my judgments, and I based it on this evidence, and I have confidence that this evidence proves the standards because ... And it's a big ask for teachers, but that's why there's training available, there's exemplification materials, all of those kind of things too.
I'm more than happy to accept that my example wasn't the best, because I was making up and thinking on the spot, right, how complex can I make this combination of mathematical ideas? But yeah, I appreciate, and I do think that's important for teachers to realize, is that they can make those connections. Sean, from your point of view, listening to Tom speak about the process and the evidence collection. This is your first year in year two. What's it been like so far with regards to that sort of year-long moderation process?
I think in terms of the gathering of evidence, we kind of really started thinking about that just before Christmas, about actually formally doing that, because there is the idea that we could look at evidence from before Christmas, but we don't want to be depending on it. So I think that's where I think it comes back to being a little bit creative with how you gather that evidence. And again, I'm talking from a specifically maths point of view, because the nature of the curriculum coverage is the issue. It's the nature of the subject, isn't it? With writing, with reading, they're kind of transferable skills. As long as, say, for is reading, as long as the text is age appropriate, then we're good to go on with most of those skills. And writing, again, as long as you're doing a range of text types, and exposing them to a variety, exposing them to that variety of text types, and exposing them to a variety of skills, and encouraging the children to apply their skills, then you should be okay. But then when it comes to maths, I think that's, like you said, you have to be a little bit more thoughtful in how you structure your curriculum. Our maths curriculum is structured very much. You do addition before Christmas, you do money before Christmas, you do multiplication in term 3. So that could have stymied us a little bit. So what we had to have a discussion about, where are we going to build in that retrieval practice? Where are we going to revisit these things? I think that has made the evidence stronger, because what that means is, so we do it in the form of our starter tasks a lot of the time. In year 2, we'll have a sheet at the back of the book. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The children come in. They look at Monday's work. It could be on money. They did money in November, but it's the revisit. Now, if they can do independently something that they learned in November, we know that they're quite strong at that. So as far as the working towards and the expected goes, we're actually I think we're fairly, that's been okay, as long as you're willing to think it through. I think in terms of the greater depth, that's where it possibly proves a little bit more challenging, where you're, having to build in time for children to meet those targets. And really thinking about, okay, for example, time in our curriculum, year 2, time isn't meant to come until the very end of the year. So we need to expose them to that. Position and direction doesn't feature strongly on the actual ITAFs, but it does come up on the test. So we do need to cover before, you need to cover before the SATs. But there's an example of one that we've mostly pushed towards the end of the year, because we were confident that we're actually covering it partially in computing at the moment. So we're confident enough that they'll have the knowledge coming into the SATs, and that we can cover it in depth after the ITAFs are collected. So it's, like I said, it's about being creative and building in that time into your curriculum, so the children are exposed to the complete diet of the curriculum, and you're not left with parts of the curriculum completely uncovered and doing yourself a disservice, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Just a really careful note. You said ITAFs. Sean.
Yeah.
So this is where me as a moderator, is where I've got slight alarm bells. So Kieran, feel free to edit this out if you want. But the ITAFs is Interim Teacher Assessment Framework. And that's pre-2018, 2019.
I'm still calling it by old money.
I know. And I'm thinking of the person listening thinking, I'm using TAFs. Should I be using ITAFs?
It actually does say TAFs on the top of the document.
Absolutely. I've got to do that check. I'm in moderator mode thinking, hold on a second. Are we using the same standards? And that's a really important point that we might have skipped over. So I'm really glad it came up, because I see it. Schools ask me about advice for preparing for moderation. And one of those things is make sure you're using the 2018, 19 and beyond things. Anything that says interim on is not the up-to-date stuff. We might slip into the ITAF, and I've had to teach myself out of it. But yeah, just for the the casual listener thinking, hold on a second, am I using the wrong stuff?
That's
I
fair
better
enough.
raise that. I better raise that in case someone goes back and changes their paperwork.
I'll happily take that on board.
No, I think I'm keeping that in because that is a very important point. We're talking about a profession that's still called the 2014 curriculum, the new national curriculum. We're not great at name changes. I think that
No, we're not, and we slip into shortenings, acronyms, everything, don't we, just to make our life that a little bit easier. So yeah, for anyone listening, TAF, Teacher Assessment Framework, yeah, and ARA, Assessment and Reporting. We could make a whole glossary of all these shortenings that we use. In Key Stage 2, you'll be familiar with the TAG, Teacher Assessment or Test Administration Guidance. But in Year 2, there's both. There's Teacher Assessment Guidance and Test Administration Guidance. So we've always got to be careful that everyone's using the same phrase and using it in the same way.
My second idea that came up from your description, Tom, I thought, are schools with moderators in the pool at an advantage to schools that don't have moderators or teachers who are moderators in the pool because they almost understand the process that little bit more than someone who's not involved in the school sort of level moderation?
Yeah, I mean, what you're really asking is a school with more knowledge at an advantage to a school that has less knowledge. And I think the answer is yes. So even if you choose not to put yourself forward to be a pool moderator, it's really good advice to make sure that someone in the team, the wider team, goes through the process of moderator training. Because you need that knowledge. You need to know what constitutes good evidence, how to use the exemplification materials, and to look out for the common pitfalls that you might only come across through the dialogue that happens in those training events. So you might look at a statement. I'll choose a statement that notoriously schools struggle with getting evidence for because it's deceptive, right? So from the teacher assessment framework, the maths framework, working expected standard, the children have to recall all number bonds to and within 10 and use these to reason with and calculate bonds to and within 20, recognizing other additive relationships, right? That's basically 5 statements in one, but it's written as one bullet point. So, the Standards and Testing Agency have put this together, thought, oh, we need to be as concise as possible. We need to make this easy to remember. We'll have a statement in there about number bonds, but really it's, can the children recall number bonds to and within 10? Great, one statement. Can they use these number bonds to reason? That's another one. Can they calculate these bonds and reason with bonds within 20? Okay, that's another one. And then recognize other additive relationships. So that's subtraction. That's like the fact families, for want of a better term. So we're basically got 4 or 5 statements as one bullet point. If you don't go on the moderator training, that might pass you by. You might look at that and think, yeah, my kids know their number bonds to 10. I'm confident with that. And the real kicker in that statement is that it's not only an and statement, this and this and this and this. It's an all statement. So you need to be able to present evidence that that these children you said are expected standard can do this for all of their number bonds within 10. So a picky moderator like me might go, are you certain for the number 9? How do you know? And someone doesn't need to pull out like a book and go, look, they've done pages of work of making 9 in different ways and using that for 19, and here are their fact families. But I know it because we've done it through our daily starters, and we've done it for all numbers, and we've done it systematically throughout the term. I've made notes of those children who don't, and blah, blah, blah. But because it's an and statement, there's several points, and it's an all statement as well. So you can't just go, well, because the child knows it for 7, they must be fine with the rest of them. So yeah, I think you're at a massive advantage if you have that knowledge in your building, that someone's been on the training. And because for some people, to use your term, Kieran, scales from the eyes moment, that kind of, whoa, it really means all of that, and didn't realize it meant that much stuff. And that then becomes a discussion point that feeds into your planning, doesn't it? No one's asking for teachers to present a whole portfolio raft of evidence. The moderator is there to, in the professional discussion, go, how did you make those judgments? And how do you know your judgments are accurate? So that the inferences you've made about the standard that child's working with aren't led by any sort of bias, and that you're confident, not just for these children we've chosen, but for the whole class. So yeah, I think there are huge advantages for going through the process. Even this year, like I said, it's the online process of, you know, the self-directed study. However, I would say one of the weaknesses of the moderation process, the moderation training, is there is a much bigger emphasis on writing than there is on reading and maths. So it really benefits to make sure you're having these types of dialogues with experienced moderators who've been through it several times.
What is the purpose of moderation, and do you think that it fulfills its purpose well?
Okay, I'll make a start on fielding it, and then I'll ask Sean what he thinks. I don't know how familiar people are with the kind of the Russian proverb that was made famous by ex-American presidents of trust but verify. You know, that kind of, we want to trust teachers. We want to know that teachers are really accurate in their judgments, but we are going to include some verification process. And the vast majority of the time, it's in-house verification. You do that yourselves. Here's all the paperwork you need to do it. Go through that process and you'll be absolutely fine. And every 4 years, people like me, moderation teams, come in and we look at 10% of the children for reading, 10% for writing, or 10% for maths, or if you've got small cohorts, a minimum of 3 children for each. So we might be looking at only 10% of your cohort. So we're trusting your judgment for the other 90%. Now, with trust comes a lot of autonomy. You know, we're putting a lot of responsibility in teachers' hands and we're trusting their professional judgment. But I do think that verification is needed. You know, if we're only going to come around and check in once every 4 years, we want to know that what's happening when we're not there is still in line with the guidance. People are still going through their statutory responsibilities. So do I think that the moderation process is working? Does it work well? That depends on how well schools are doing the moderation process when people like me aren't there. And for some schools, they will hand on heart say, yeah, we put a lot of time, effort and energy into doing it. We've got lots of well-trained, well-informed people. And for other schools, we don't have those people in-house, but local schools do. So we rely on that evidence. Can I say with confidence that that happens really effectively everywhere? I don't have that kind of that knowledge or know-how. Sean, in your experience, the support you've had from colleagues at school, do you feel like you're surrounded by people who've been through this process, know how to guide you through it, and that you kind of trust those judgments that have been made outside of the statutory window every 4 years?
We have one colleague in year 2 who's also been through the process in this school. You know, I think that's been helpful. Our assistant head is taught in Key Stage 1, and again, she's been part of the process. So I think that has kind of helped. I had been on the training in a previous school. That was the ill-fated 2020 training. Obviously, I gathered the evidence, but we didn't get there. Generally, I think the support has been there. We've been having those kind of, obviously much less so at the start of the year, but as the year has gone on, we've been having those conversations more and more frequently. We have a teacher who was is an NQT +1 in our year group as well, so it's been important to support her and kind of just ongoing clarification that we're all doing the same thing and we're all trying to have the same expectations for the same targets. Again, I think that's helped because we do shared planning, so we are all doing the same tasks. But again, touching base, especially, and making sure I suppose all of us having a kind of a shared understanding. Well, this is what expected is for this particular thing, or making sure that if we are unsure, that we go and talk to each other about it and and discuss the evidence. I sat in an internal moderation today as part of a staff meeting, and again, also having other people who aren't part of the the evidence gathering rat race to come in with a fresh pair of eyes. We had our head teacher come in and have a look. We had a PPA.
They've got to be there. They've read the head teacher's declaration that they've got to make sure it's
well. There is that, exactly. But having people who are just coming in a fresh pair of eyes again is, I think, was a useful exercise today, because we needed to have that narrative straight in our head about the children that we that we presented, And, you know, again, that little bit of challenge saying, well, how do you know? And how have you come to this judgment? And are you sure? Not to catch you out, but actually, am I sure? What is my evidence?
That's great.
And how robust is that evidence really?
I think that's really healthy, Sean. And it's great
Yeah.
for people to hear that, because when most people think moderation, they think external. They think the
Yes.
role of someone coming in and kind of holding you to account and having that dialogue. But even that dialogue, when someone like me comes in, it always starts with that question I just asked you. What does moderation look like when we're not here? Because schools are expected to have gone through that process almost expecting to be moderated. You don't know whether you're going to get the phone call or the email or whatever on Friday the 13th this year. So you've got to assume you've got to go through all those processes. And it sounds like you've got a really healthy system that doesn't just include the year 2 team, but people from outside. And that can really help overcome any potential biases and make you go through those difficult conversations of how do we know? How can we be certain that across this collection of evidence, we've got everything we need to support our judgment? So if other schools are in the position that you're in and have the confidence that you have, then to answer your question, Kieran, I think, the process of moderation is fulfilling its purpose, because it's making people have conversations that might otherwise be difficult to have, but are necessary. You know, I think it's great if you've got some of those year 3 teachers coming involved in that conversation, not only to learn the pupils, but so they have a shared understanding of what to expect for those expected standard children coming up. Do they know that it's okay for children to use verbal methods of working out or informal jottings of working out? They might not, but if they join in your process, like you're talking about, or what it means for writing to be coherent at a greater depth level, that's even better for their subject knowledge and their professional development as well, isn't it? So I think that's fab. I think you've described a really healthy process. It might not be comfortable and it might be time intensive, and it is, but it's a statutory thing and it happens once at the end of the key stage. So is it worthwhile? I can't say for every school that it's going perfectly, but if the process you've described is replicated across your local area, across the county, across the country, then we can be proud that we've got a really diligent profession who are doing the right thing. So it sounds good to me.
I think from my point of view, when I first started teaching, my experience, I came in at the tail end of levels, and I found even though we had a shared document where we were all, you know, everyone across the country was using these, and obviously the sub levels were invented and things like that. But I found the problem was you had 6 different schools, 6 different opinions on what a sentence opener was, or what ambitious vocabulary was, or interesting the audience was. So I think it's incredibly important to have someone say, this is the shared expectation, this is what it looks like, because like you said, it's very easy for everyone to read the same sentence and people to get entirely different meanings from it.
Yeah, so I think that is a really important point. And I know, Kieran, it was covered in the Key Stage 2 writing moderation, wasn't it? The difficulties of moderating with other schools, the people coming in from different points, sometimes being a bit precious about our ego, so there's no pushback. And I think one of the strengths of the Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 moderation materials that STA put online is that once the moderators have done all their training, any school can access that stuff on the primary assessment gateway. They can look at the standardization materials and, importantly, the commentary that goes with it, that basically says, this is why this is an effective piece that shows ... And I think that's so useful. So useful. So if you are in that difficult conversation and you need like a third party to say, no, this is what we mean by coherence, that paperwork exists. And it's not a person, it's not an opinion then. The document exists that this is the standard by which we're comparing these children's work to. And the other strength as well is we're expected to show that a child can do it across a collection of writing. We're not saying this one piece of writing is the be all and end all of how good that child is a writer. We're saying across this collection, they can demonstrate this standard, this skill, whatever it may be. And that can be hard to do with another school, because we're talking about looking at one child, several pieces of writing over a long period of time, but it's probably easier to do internally. You can do it bit by bit over time. You can use the exemplification materials. You can use the annotated commentaries from the STA on the Primary Assessment Gateway. There's lots of things you can use to do it well. However, if we are going to do it well, it is time intensive. And we all have to accept that this is a big ask of schools to facilitate this time. It's resource heavy. You know, you have to then think about the opportunity costs involved. But thankfully, we're not doing it every year. We're not doing it for every year group. We're not doing it for every child. We're doing it for a sample of children. And we're trusting then that teachers use that experience to inform their other judgments. So is it a perfect system? No, but the tools are there for teachers to do it really well if given the opportunity to do so. And I think that some teachers would say that they've had negative experiences in the past, but that's definitely not the case for everyone, because those positive experiences are there to be had.
That leads really nicely into my next loaded question. And it's about, what impact does the gathering of evidence have on teaching and on workload? Don't know, Sean, if you want to start with you and your sort of opinion, because essentially you've been trusted to work through the process yourself this year. So any impact on teaching and workload will sort of almost fall on your own shoulders, I think. It's a result of the process and the decisions you've made. So we're not pointing fingers at anyone, because I know you've been a really supportive sort of senior leadership team, you know, but it's more a case of, you know, so has there been an impact on what you've taught, you know, and the workload that you've had as a result?
I think it has made some, you know, I think I would be lying if I was saying there wasn't some impact in terms of the decisions I've made, again, particularly in maths, where even, you know, perhaps children, you know, I could have chosen something else that for a bit of arithmetic at the start of the lesson. But actually I need some evidence on partitioning. Now, I don't believe in evidence for evidence sake. If I made that decision, it would have been, well, actually, that's something I will need to practice they will need a bit of practice at some stage, but perhaps it might have happened a little bit later in the year, or a different point, or in a different form. That, you know, it certainly does play a role. And definitely combing through a piece of work and saying, say, for example, writing, have they used capital letters? Have they used full stops? Is that on the year 2 common exception list, or is that on the year 1 common exception list? That can take more time. But I suppose it's about, you know, trying to take a reasonably healthy look at it, and saying, all right, you know, for writing, we're not going to have an assessed piece of writing every day. We try and do maybe one every week if it suits, you know, and I think that's a really, does it suit what we're doing? Because there's no point in doing it just completely in isolation. It's not going to be good as an assessment piece, and it's not going to be, the children aren't going to get anything out of it. It does increase the workload to a degree, because when you are planning, you are thinking, well, where, you know, am I going to get the evidence for this? What form does that need to take? You mentioned the exemplification materials. They are incredibly helpful, especially for maths, where the greater depth, some of the greater depth targets are they can be initially slightly convoluted sounding, and as, oh, that's what that looks like. Now, and if you're going, and eventually, you know, I've had a good few looks at it at this stage. I'm, you know, looking at it regularly enough, so I know what it looks like now. But initially, having to go, oh, what, you know, scroll down on a document and say, does that match what they're looking for? Or is that really, you know, reading into what they're looking for? Yes, it's time. I think that would have an impact on workload. But hopefully, as the process becomes more automatic, and if you know, the more experienced you become, obviously your judgment becomes more secure, and you can become more confident in that, can't you?
Yeah, so I think I agree with loads that I was nodding along as Sean's talking. You know, there is no doubt your workload is going to be affected by having to think about these statements. To play slight devil's advocate, I imagine the same would be said if any teacher has to make a teacher assessment judgment against key performance indicators. So if in their school they have key performance indicators for the end of year 4, and we're only going to assess that child at expected standard or on track for expected standard if they've met all of them, then it would have an impact on that teacher's workload as well. It's just that in year 2, the key performance indicators are dictated to us, and we have to be able to show all of them. There is a case, we won't go into detail about writing, and particular weakness and everything that comes with that. But for almost every single situation, we have to say with confidence that the child's met all of the statements. It's a secure fit. And that's hard. And like Sean says, a lot of the workload that goes into that is thought. How have we collected that? Where have we collected that? How do I know for certain? Now, that's not to say that some schools do this neatly. Some schools go way over the top. As someone who's moderated lots of schools over several years, schools don't all present this in the same way. Some teachers come up with their books and they're happy to talk through it, and that's it. They've done no extra paperwork, but they know it. They know it really well. And if you ask them a difficult question about where something might be, they ask, can I have a couple of minutes to find it? I know it's in here, it's round about there, and I've seen it, and da da da. Other schools have a general target sheet, so these are my teacher assessment framework statements on one side of the page. I've got all the children across the top of the page, and I've double ticked it or whatever they've done. I'm thinking way back to how I trained to be a teacher in 2001, with the double ticks or little triangles to show where they've got it. However they've done it, they've got one assessment grid over time. They can say with confidence they've seen this thing more than once. Now, some schools go way beyond that to an extreme, and they have tick sheets in the back of every child's book for every subject. And that must take teachers forever. In those schools, it's almost certainly going to have a huge impact on teacher workload. But that impact is largely the decisions they've made for how they are going to be confident they know where the evidence is and when. There's no, you must do it one way. The teacher assessment guidance, the assessment reporting arrangements doesn't say you must present your evidence in this way. But schools have all gone down totally different approaches for collecting that in. Some of them have minimal implications for workload, though it is still significant compared to not doing it all. Some schools have gone way, way beyond. And for those teachers, they must be spending hours regularly trawling through books and ticking sheets and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to go with what you think is the right approach to take. And you have to be conscious that, is it sustainable? And is it fair for your teachers to do that? And I think some approaches are probably fairer than others.
That seems to be a theme running through this, because, I promised I wouldn't openly critique the process of moderation during this episode. I'm not going to. But what you guys have done is really well field the questions, which almost prod and poke while getting an understanding of how we can cope with it, And, I think as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, right, when schools manage this process well, actually, a lot of the things that I don't like about the system can be mitigated. So I think it's been really, really useful listening to both your experiences on this, because I'm sort of getting a more rounded approach, whereas I may have dug myself a little trench over the last couple of years. And so now I can see over the side of it and thinking, okay, maybe things aren't as extreme as in every case, but, like you said, Tom, I think some schools do, have room to pull back just a slight bit.
Yeah, and I think your reflection there, Kieran, will be similar to lots of teachers, especially if they haven't been through the process in the last couple of years. Like Sean said right at the start, or you said right at the start, we haven't been through this process formally since June 2019, and that was the most recent schools. There are schools that have not been through it since June 2016, and when it was an interim assessment framework statement. So that's where our episodic memory comes in, doesn't it? The kind of my feelings about the event distort how I remember the event. So if it felt really uncomfortable, if it felt really time intensive, I'm not going to have the most positive memories of it. If I've been through it more recently, I might have a more rounded experience of it. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone loves moderation. It's not always comfortable for the moderator either. But if you can have a really good professional dialogue in that moderation meeting, I think it's a really potentially very powerful and useful experience for everyone involved.
My final question, and I'm going to send this your way, Tom. What alternatives are there?
Okay, so when we're thinking about alternatives to teacher assessment at the end of Key Stage 1. There are no alternatives to the statutory teacher assessment framework model. It's not going away. You know, they're going to remove SATs in a couple of years. So the teacher assessment framework model's got to stick around, you know, and I'd really encourage schools to still use some sort of standardized test. Going back to the points I said before about making sure that our judgments are valid and free from bias. So I don't think there's a viable alternative in replacing the system, because we rely on it as a system, as a, you know, we rely on it at the moment, and it's not going away. And also, to go back to the point I mentioned previously, for the vast majority of time, you are not going through the external moderation process. You're going through the internal moderation process for 3 years out of 4, and also for the 90% of children that the moderator doesn't look at. So there needs to be something, it needs to be standardized, and the system that we've got isn't going anywhere. So I don't think there are any alternatives to the statutory approach at the moment, and probably not for a good while yet, many years. But it's about how the alternative to maybe how we collect, gather, present, have conversations around our evidence. That's worth thinking about. There will be some schools listening to this thinking, wow, I think we're doing way too much. There might be other schools thinking, I don't think we do enough. And for those schools, healthy alternatives do exist. But is there an alternative to the whole system? No, not for now, not at least for the next few years anyway.
So if you were senior leader in a school and you were asking your Key Stage 1 lead to prepare the process for the coming year, what would you have them do?
So I'd go way back to the start of the year and think about curriculum mapping. What type of evidence do we need to have? What does that mean in terms of our knowledge of teachers? Do all teachers know what we mean by writing effectively and coherently? And there might be some subject knowledge gaps there. And senior leaders need to be on top of that and providing opportunities to support their colleagues to fill those gaps. There needs to be a regular, informal process of talking about reading, writing, maths, what we mean by expected standard, and doing that gradually over time and not burdening teachers with very rare or one-off mega meetings that no one really enjoys and we haven't got time to do things well. So developing the knowledge in the team, developing our process gradually over time, and trying to have a system of recording our evidence in a sustainable and easy to manage way. If you can do all of those things, then it's likely to benefit the teacher's subject knowledge. It's likely to improve their understanding of what, you know, STA at least says expected standard is. And if we involve colleagues from other year groups, like Sean mentioned before, we're spreading the benefit wider than just year 2. There's a lot of questions there, and there's a lot of thinking for schools to go through that process. And they'll have to think carefully about the size of their school, because that process for a 3-class school with only 60 children across the whole school is going to be very different to a huge infant school, for example, or huge junior school, or through primary, 4 form entry. So you have to think about your context, and including context, your teachers, their subject knowledge, their prior experience, your systems, all of those kind of things. But if they're aligned together and it's gradually planned over time, so there are not too many pinch points, then it's much more likely to be successful than doing it last minute, ad hoc, and kind of flying by the seat of our pants. So yeah.
And if you ever decide to come back into school leadership, Tom, it'll be a very lucky school that has you sort of organising that approach. Yeah, that sounds brilliant. Sean, what would you do? You know, you're education minister. You can choose an alternative. What would you do?
I think definitely there's a lot to be said about lot to be said for comparative judgment. I definitely think that teachers shouldn't be judging their own pupils' work in isolation, because you are unfortunately the way the humans work, we are full of biases, and we don't mean to be, but all of us here have biases, and we take those into every lesson we teach and every judgment we make. And obviously it's for us, if we're going to, if we want to be the best teachers we can be, to try and shed ourselves of those. But that is almost impossible by yourself, I would say. So what really, if you want an objective judgment, what has to happen is you need to get children's work compared to each other. You need to have a group of people together comparing them, and have had experience with some comparative judgment in our school already. And I found those conversations to be quite useful, where we all decide, well, this piece is better than this, and here's why, and those professional discussions. And generally, I think if you increase that, you have a larger amount of people involved in that conversation, it's quite accurate. It becomes more and more accurate, obviously, the bigger the sample size, doesn't it? So I've always found that useful. If there was some way of creating, of kind of putting comparative judgment across schools, I think that would certainly help. Because there has to be something in place to ensure that these judgments are accurate. But it's about how do you stimulate that professional conversation between colleagues.
Yeah. So Sean, just to add to that point, are we talking about comparative judgment of several pieces of work for the same child? So the child writing for different audiences and different purposes. Because if we think about the no more marking model, all the children are doing the same piece, aren't we? And we're comparing.
Our school has been involved in is using the no more marking model, and we've also done the system where everyone gets together on a computer and discusses it as well. And the pieces come up on the screen, and you judge, well, this is better than that one and this is better than that one. You rank them. I would find the internal one a lot better, because it's as well, the people involved all know the children then.
Yeah.
And
so my question is, would we do it for several different pieces of work? So we've got a range of audiences, a range of purposes, and those kind of things. Because we all know, don't we, that if it was based on one piece of work, that is real hit and miss. We're talking about 6 of the 7.
I think definitely. I think that would be. I think I've certainly earlier on in my career, I was involved in those pieces where it was just, here's a piece of work, that's your level for the term, that's it. And that was not helpful for anyone. So I would say, and I think again, it comes back to this is where the current moderation process is useful, I suppose, isn't it? Because it's a body of work.
Yeah, over a period of time.
Over a period of time, and you can see how that body of work has developed. So I suppose that is a real strength. That is a real strength in the moderation process. I suppose it's just, how can you? I suppose it's, how can you introduce a bit more comparative judgment into that? Possibly. I think
it's a really good point. I think you've got you've got something there. There's so many different dynamics, aren't there? The hardest thing about moderation is ensuring that the work's independent. There are big question marks about the extent to which we can use success criteria, teacher modeling, shared or guided writing, all of those kind of things. And the no more marking approaches, well, we're doing away with that, aren't we? Like, this is a cold piece. No one's seen it before. There's no talk about it. Off you go. And at least we can guarantee then, hopefully, fingers crossed, if everyone plays by the rules, no one's gaming the system, that everything's fair, everyone's independent. But again, my concern is always, it's just that one piece, that one audience, that one purpose. If one child flunks that day and they don't show a good reflection of themselves, what do we do from there? And I think if we're going to improve the system, we have to have several pieces of work for each child. I might be way off. This is slightly out of my realm of expertise, definitely. But yeah, definitely something to think about.
I think that would make for a really good debate, because obviously we've had the writing moderation episode. We've got these ideas here where you guys are talking about, actually there are some benefits to what we have in place. I don't know, maybe we'll see if we can arrange it for the Discord initially, and then it'd be great to have it live. Like those big debates they have like maybe a panel of 5 or 6 people. I'd be really interested to see it.
I don't know where I'd sit.
Well, maybe you don't need to pick a side. Maybe it's just a nice, decent chat about education. It's one to think about.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating listening to you guys, because obviously I can remember my preconceived notions. What I'm really glad is that I haven't suffered from the backfire effect, and actually I've been nodding and listening, thinking, no, I didn't double down on some of my preconceived notions. So there's hope for me yet. All that's left to do, Sean, is say thank you very much for your first time. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for... Oh, people could watch and listen to this episode if you got Spotify, this is going to be a watch. So thank you for watching and listening.